Welcome to the Quark and Roll podcast. I am your host, Kwok Pui Lan. Today's guest is Dr. Christine Pae, who teaches religion and ethics at Denison University in Ohio. In this episode, we will discuss Transpacific theology, spiritual activism, and the future of feminist theology. Welcome to the podcast, Christine.
Thank you for inviting me.
I want to begin by asking, what is Transpacific imagination in theology and ethics? Because you have written this wonderful book that is talking about Transpacific imagination of theology and ethics and spiritual activism.
Trained as a social ethicist, I wanted to elaborate on transnational feminist ethics grounded in feminist liberation theology and post-colonial theology. And among the possible entry points to transnational feminist ethics, I chose to explore the lived experiences and memories of Asian and Asian American women, as well as gender-minoritized people, questioning how their lives on different shores of the Pacific are intimately connected. So I follow your work, Kwok Pui Lan's work, then I conceptualize the Trans-Pacific as a contact zone where diverse cultures, peoples, and histories intersect and clash. And at the same time, I imagined that Pacific Ocean remembers the imperial desires and empires of Europe, the United States, and Japan, along with the forced migration, wars, and exploitation at the cost of exoticized Asian Pacific women's bodies. As a theologian and social ethicist, I wanted to reflect on what kind of God would emerge from the Pacific if God were analogous to the ocean, which remembers the joy and tears of all living creatures. So for me, transnational and transpacific feminist theological ethics represents a radical praxis that produces liberative and transformative knowledge of gender, sexuality, and the sacred. This knowledge is embodied enough to inspire and generate creative and courageous movements for structural change. And another big question is how to interrogate the globally asymmetric power structures constructed by various historical, legal, and geopolitical institutions and Euro-American colonialism and their impact on globally disenfranchised people. So the primary goal of analyzing global power structures is to explore ways to practice transnational solidarity across differences in specific political and economic situations. So I theologically conceptualized solidarity based on interstitial integrity as the images of human realities and the divine, and with the spiritual activism, its manifestation. So all these three theological categories are imagined in the Trans-Pacific, especially through the experiences of Asian and Asian American women.
Thank you very much for your work. You have also contributed to a chapter of the book that I edited, Transpacific Political Theology. Now you have studied and done field research on spiritual activism for a long time. Can you explain to the audience what does spiritual activism mean?
Spiritual activism is the core of my Transpacific feminist theology and ethics. And I first learned spiritual activism from Gloria Anzaldúa scholar Anna Louise Keating. So according to Keating, Anzaldúa's innovative theory of spiritual activism emphasizes spiritual activism is a completely embodied political endeavor, as much spiritual as it is about inner transformation. So conversing with Anzaldúa, I reflect on spiritual activism as a crucial aspect of transnational feminist theological ethics. So as a concept, spiritual activism emphasizes the inseparability between one's inner spiritual transformation and one's outer work for social change aligned with peace and justice, while overcoming the oppositional consciousness of right versus wrong. And especially women's spiritual activism is generated through their diverse experiences with the sacred and the divine. And my understanding of spiritual activism has continually evolved thanks to new feminist practices, alternative visions, critical conversations, global solidarity movement, and an expanding transnational feminist network. However, two concepts have been central to my meditation on spiritual activism, and those two concepts are interconnectedness and interstitial integrity. And Brazilian ecofeminist theologian Ivani Guevara understands relatedness as the primary reality constitutive of all living beings. We may comprehend interconnectedness or imagine ourselves as part of this vast web of interconnectedness only at a metaphysical or spiritual level. So as Guevara defines relatedness or interconnectedness from a Christian ecofeminist perspective, relatedness can be understood as a religious experience, a cosmic condition, and an experience of the divine. So recognizing oneself as interconnected with all living beings can be compared to a spiritual reckoning with a rediscovered reality of being. And a deep appreciation of interconnectedness helps us recognize our deep yearning for the sacred and move beyond oppositional politics. And I'm especially influenced by M. Jackie Alexander's understanding of spiritual activism here too. And M. Jackie Alexander argues that the work of decolonization should make room for the deep longing for wholeness expressed on material, physical, existential, and psychic levels, because colonization has produced fragmentation and dismemberment at both the material and psychic levels. So our movement toward wholeness, or what Alexander calls the work of spirit and journey, opens our very core to the fundamental truth. We are all connected to the divine, the erotic, and the sacred through our connections with each other. Such spiritual interconnectedness prompts us to assemble and reassemble ourselves in the community while working for social justice. And this community includes both imaginative and physical communities. And the notion of interstitial integrity as conceptualized by Asian American feminist theologian Rita Nakashima Brock suggests this construction of the self within interconnectedness. Certainly the self is always in radical relationality to others, including non-human beings, peoples, multiple cultures, social systems, religions, and spiritualities. And interstitial integrity is similar to Gloria Anzaldua's concept of nepentala, meaning in between or betwixt times and spaces, where a person's sense of who and what they are is continuously undergoing change. Brock's interstitial integrity highlights Asian and Asian American women's embodied identity grounded betwixt and between engaged relationships and the feminist theological praxis of decolonization. And interstitial integrity also characterizes the fluidity of our identities, which are always co-constitutive with other cultural, racial, sexual, and religious identities, namely the story of racial relations and imagination on North American soil and beyond. In the meantime, interstitial integrity gives full attention to the agency of a person, not as an individualized entity, but as a relational being. Given this reality, interstitial integrity cultivates the wisdom of survivor and resistance betwixt and between engaged relationships. In return, wisdom born and reborn in interstitial integrity reveals and re-reveals God, ever-changing and expanding the life of interstitial integrity. And I saw the prime example of spiritual activism at the Sunlit Center in South Korea. The Sunlit Center has advocated for older women who used to work in prostitution industry around U.S. military bases in South Korea. The Sunni Center offers a unique space where former military prostitutes can meet and share their experiences of working in military prostitution. At the same time, the center has raised consciousness of gender-based state-sanctioned violence and U.S. military crimes so that the women can see their personal experiences from a transnational feminist perspective. The consciousness-raising effort expands beyond the center to the public. The center used multiple tools in raising public consciousness of the long history of military prostitution as a staple in U.S.-Korea relations. They have blogged, published opinion pieces in the media, opened a Camptown museum, and preserved the oral history of Camptown prostitution. Many artists have also volunteered for the Sunni Center's activism. They offered art therapy sessions for these elderly former Camptown sex workers. Based on their stories, these women created a stage play and musical for public performance. For more than 10 years, I have observed these women breaking their silence and becoming peace activists while healing themselves from traumatic experiences. So borrowed Dorothy Jelly's words, I call the Sunni Center women healed healers. So spiritual activists are healed healers who see God's presence in healing individuals, society, and the world. And at the same time, they empathize with the suffering. Together, they embody peace with justice.
I am so glad to hear these women doing this very important healing and reconciliation work. Now, you have co-edited a book that is called Searching for the Future in the Past, which is about reclaiming feminist theological vision. Some of my students will say feminist theology or feminism is passé. Why is this important at this time?
I co-edited Searching for the Future in the Past with the practical theologian Kathy Tarvecchia, who has been my good friend and mentor. And the book was first conceived as a collective vision of Anna Turton, senior editor of T&T Clark's Religion and Theology books. Anna first approached Kathy and me with the question of why feminist theology still mattered in the 21st century. So for Kathy and me, feminist theology is still an invincible tool in liberating women-identified people and gender-minoritized people from various forms of violence and oppression. However, convincing others of the importance of feminist theology in academia, society, and people's everyday life was a challenging task. And Kathy and I questioned a lot about whether feminist theology can speak to especially gender-minoritized people where sexual identity has been weaponized in the United States. So we envisioned our book with a bold assumption. So in our current social, political, and environmental context, we need an inclusive, creative, audacious, and radical feminist theology for life, peace, and justice, even more now than when it was systematically developed in the 1960s. There are many critical issues that require gender analysis intersecting with the sexuality, race, and class. These issues include the persistence of gender-based and racialized violence, heteronormativity and white supremacy, the feminization of global poverty, the impact of climate change, reproductive justice issues, and the resurgence of religious fundamentalism. In the meantime, the current U.S. political climate has weaponized gender and sexuality to consolidate right-wing politics and Christian ideologies against women and LGBTQI plus people who refuse to cooperate with heteropatriarchal family values, and racialized minorities who resist normalized white supremacy. And as many people know, gender and sexuality have been constantly used in order to criminalize immigrants and religious minorities in the United States. And historically speaking, feminist theologians have offered the most radical visions for peace and justice in their respective times. Engaging with feminist theology in the 21st century means consciously tracing the palimpsests of feminist theopolitical activism in our church and society and renewing these palimpsests in our own socio-political context to create another layer of feminist theology. So in that sense, renewing feminist theology refuse to understand history linearly, but we understand the history as a palimpsestic time where the past is constantly unfolded in the present and the present moment constantly brings the future into our life at this time.
I know that you have been doing some research on Christian Zionism, and Christian Zionism is growing by leaps and bounds in the global south, especially in South Korea. Can you explain why?
There are multiple reasons, including literary reading of the Christian Bible, the legacy of anti-communist Christian nationalism proposed by South Korea's first president, Syngman Rhee, followed by military dictator Park Chung-hee, who idealized Jewish Israel, and prosperity gospel, along with secularizing politics. And then I understand South Korean Christian Zionism through Emily Town's concept of fantastic hegemonic imagination. So according to one statistic, approximately 1,000 Jews live in Korea. The vast majority of them are American military personnel. And Korea has never sustained a visible Jewish community, nor has it had a historical memory of anti-Semitism. And despite the near total absence of Jews in Israel in the almost 5,000-year history of Korea, many Korean evangelicals express devotion to the state of Israel and love for Jews. So why do they love Jewish Israel as if the state were their own? And I questioned a lot, and my tentative answer is because their imagined tripartite alliance among God's chosen nations, the United States, Israel, and South Korea. So while American Protestant fundamentalism has undoubtedly shaped the contours of Christian Zionism on Korean soil, this apocalyptic fantasy has evolved through Korea's complex political context. And during the Japanese colonial period from 1910 through 1945, Korean Protestants elaborated on dispensationalist pre-millennial perspective on politics, envisioning God of liberation who would deliver Koreans from brutal Japanese colonial rules and finally end the Japanese Empire. But however, Korean Christians' eschatological imagination has evolved around Jewish Israel as God's chosen nation, particularly since South Korea's first president, Syngman Rhee, propagated anti-communist Protestant nationalism after the Korean War, and military dictator Park Chung-hee mobilized the image of Israel as a model for his anti-communist, development-driven regime. Korean Christian Zionist fundamentalists adhere to chosen people's nationalism that combines like pro-Americanism, philo-Israelism, and national aspirations for Korean reunification, anti-LGBTQI, and anti-Muslim sentiment. And by casting Korea as God's chosen nation along with the United States and Israel, Korean Christian Zionists have positioned themselves within a global right-wing evangelical network. Their activism includes promoting the Aliyah movement, or taking Jews back to Israel, or forging alliances with American Christian Zionist organizations, pursuing aggressive missionary campaigns in Muslim-majority regions, particularly within the 1040 window. And they also inaugurate institutions such as the Holocaust Museum Korea. So Korea is the third country where the Holocaust Museum is opened next to Israel and the United States. So what is absent from Korean Christian Zionists is any acknowledgement of Palestine, Palestinian people and Palestinian history and their suffering have been completely ignored in Christian Zionist movement. And the realities of Israeli occupation and the ongoing genocide in Gaza are absent from Christian Zionist triumphalist narrative of chosenness and eschatological destiny. And another layer is the Israeli Ministry of Tourism has also actively recruited Korean pastors and lay people to promote Zionist Holy Land tourism. And in 2019, before COVID-19 interrupted international travels, approximately 60,000 Korean tourists visited Israel to feel the life and presence of Jesus romantically. So for my current project, which involves mapping out Christian Zionism in Korea with my co-researcher, I have interviewed multiple Christian scholars and leaders. And they say that perhaps more than 90% of Korean Christians are Zionists, even if the majority of them are not fundamentalists. They are not conscious of Christian Zionism deeply ingrained in their faith, interpretation of the Bible and liturgy. And these ordinary Christians, or what scholar Peter Miano calls mainstream Christian Zionists, are the sustainers of Christian Zionism in Korea and beyond.
Christine, can you tell us what are your hopes as an Episcopal priest and ethicist, and how might churches be involved in the pursuit for justice?
This is a difficult question. Although I'm an Episcopal priest, I have not been involved in parish ministry compared to many Episcopal priests. And my activism is related to knowledge production. And yet I have met a lot of parish ministers and talked to different ordinary Episcopalians and their hope for justice and their understanding of the relationship between the church and society. And my tentative conclusion is lay leadership is always important. The church has been shaped and challenged and changed by these lay people who have great hope for the church and society. And also, it is difficult to discuss political issues in the church. However, at least the church can critically reflect on the material consequences of Christian faith. So they can be more conscious of how their faith can produce or stop justice and injustice. And they can think about their faith more critically, and when they read the Bible and then when they participate in Christian liturgy. I think more about the importance of Christian liturgy in the Episcopal life. I understand that Episcopal Church is liturgy oriented, and we are challenged, and we also encounter the sacred through our liturgy, especially the Eucharist. In the church, I hope we can critically reflect on our practice of the Eucharist and Eucharistic languages and Eucharistic theology and rituals that we practice, and how these languages and practices create material realities beyond our church community. And as an ethicist, I hope many people can become more critical of how our lives are interconnected to one another beyond our immediate social circle. So I still think that interconnectedness is a spiritual reckoning. That's my hope, like how to become more conscious of interconnectedness to all living beings, so that what we do every day always matters to the larger web of life.
Thank you very much, Christine, for joining the podcast today. Please support the podcast Quark and Roll by clicking like, comment, and subscribe. I will see you in the next episode.